Practice questions are a commonly misused MCAT resource. When used correctly, they are probably the single most productive thing you can spend your time on. However, if used incorrectly, you can end up wasting dozens, if not hundreds of hours while making little to no progress. As a full-time MCAT tutor, I have spent years working to understand the MCAT better. And in this video, I'm going to go over how to make practice questions your most valuable MCAT resource. And to be clear, I'm talking about passage-based practice questions, just like the ones you would see on the real test. The first major mistake students make with practice questions is waiting too long to start doing them. It's common to wait to do them until after reading and trying to memorize the information for all of the topics that can be on the MCAT. In fact, you have probably heard about breaking up your MCAT prep into a content phase and a practice phase. That approach is deeply flawed, and in fact, many people feel like they make little to no progress during the content phase. The research on this topic is very clear, and it has shown that testing yourself is one of the best ways to help you learn and remember material. So the sooner you start doing that, the greater the effect will be. You need to do questions throughout your entire prep process, including the very beginning. An objection you may have right now is that you don't want to be tested over topics that you haven't learned about yet. That's a valid concern, and it takes us right into tip number 2. Before doing any questions, it's important to review the material that they will test you on. Doing them without covering the relevant information can be so difficult that you can end up overwhelmed and extremely confused, which is not conducive to learning. Given this, it's important that you have a resource that allows you to test yourself over specific subjects. That way you can review a chapter or maybe a few chapters and follow that up with subject-specific quizzes. To create a plan for this approach, you need to first find a source of practice questions, and here are a few of the more popular options. After you've picked one, look at how it's organized and compare it to how your content resource organizes its information. If you're using the same company for both practice questions and content, the organization is probably the same. If you're using different sources for the two, then you need to create a document that shows how the chapters from your content resource line up with the sections in your practice question resource. For example, I have a document here that shows which PDFs from the Ancient Brains content course have the material you need to cover to be prepared for each section of questions from this made-up resource. Once you make this document, before doing practice questions from any section, review the chapters that line up with it. Then do about 30 questions under normal testing timed conditions. Doing that amount makes you work on staying focused for a decent chunk of time, and you want to get used to the pace of timed conditions. Aim for at least a 70% and ideally try to reach 80% or better, depending on your goal score. If you score substantially below those percentages, review that set of questions very thoroughly and go over the relevant content again. Try to get all of that information well memorized and do another set of 30, aiming to get 70% or better. In the next video, I will go over my recommendation for what order to do the sections in and how to create a full schedule. For now, I will just say that you want to follow this template for all topics, despite what order you choose to do them in. Doing a lot of practice questions is not a guaranteed way to make improvements if you are not reviewing them thoroughly enough. The quality of your review is vastly more important than the quantity of questions that you do. I have frequently heard from people who are frustrated about the lack of progress they have made, despite doing literally thousands of questions. But I have never met someone who had a good review process and was not improving. Once you raise your review quality to a high enough level, then and only then should you focus on the amount that you're doing. I think there are many ways to review at a high quality, but here is how I have my students review, and it's a great place for you to start. After you've done a set of timed questions, start by rereading the passage very carefully and take as much time as you need. As you reread, anytime you encounter information that you reviewed while going over content, recall what you know about it and elaborate on how it fits into and makes sense in the context of the passage. For example, this sentence mentions that the drug targets acetyl-CoA carboxylase. When you read it, your analysis should sound something like this. The passage tells us that the drug mimics exercise, so we should expect to see an upregulation of things involved in catabolic processes like glycolysis, glycogenolysis, and fatty acid oxidation. We should see a downregulation of anabolic processes like glycogenesis and fatty acid synthesis. Acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase is the enzyme that turns acetyl-CoA into malonyl-CoA, and it's the rate-limiting enzyme of fatty acid synthesis. And since the drug mimics exercise and should downregulate anabolic processes, acetyl-CoA carboxylase should be downregulated, and this is actually confirmed later in the passage. Analysis like this has multiple benefits. First, it makes you actually slow down and process what you're reading. This stops you from reading through paragraphs or entire passages only to realize that you did not understand any of it. It also gives you a way to confirm that you're comprehending the passage correctly because you're double checking that the passage aligns with your content knowledge. When things don't align, you know you either read it incorrectly or you have a knowledge gap or misunderstanding. Lastly, it acts as a pop quiz over any topic that comes up in a passage. This forces you to recall topics at unexpected times, which is great for reinforcing memory and highlighting weaknesses. As you reread, the other major thing to focus on is how each paragraph connects to the rest of the passage. Read the first paragraph normally, then for each subsequent paragraph, ask yourself, how does this connect to and expand on the previous paragraphs? Similar to the previous task, this helps to keep you engaged and helps you make sure that the passage actually is making sense. As you do this and draw more connections between the paragraphs, the overall point of the passage becomes clear. Additionally, a lot of passages contain experiments and have a similar structure. They have an introductory paragraph that introduces a problem or a hypothesis, which is then followed by a description of an experiment that the researchers do to address the problem or test the hypothesis. After that section, they give you the results and the conclusion. For these passages, here are some more specific ways to challenge yourself and improve your ability to deeply understand them. First, use the first paragraph to figure out why the researchers want to conduct an experiment. Then describe the experimental setup and force yourself to visualize every detail or even draw it out. Explain how the setup will help the researchers find answers to their questions. And using knowledge from the intro and the design, predict what the results will be, and clearly spell out the mechanism that would lead to your predicted outcome. Be sure to specifically address how the experiment's design allows the researchers to collect the data shown in the results. Finally, look at the results and compare them to your prediction. And if they're different, try to figure out why. Once you finish rereading a passage like this, move on to the questions. If you reread thoroughly enough, then ideally they will be relatively easy, and sometimes you'll have already answered them while doing your passage breakdown. For each question, first rephrase it so that it is simple and easy to understand. Then go through each answer option and clearly prove why it's correct or incorrect. It's more challenging, but also very productive to do this task without the answers revealed. This is because it's very easy to rationalize and agree with an explanation even if you don't actually understand it. Doing this without knowing if they are correct or incorrect will make you think much harder, which will reveal content gaps, misunderstandings of the passage, and other weaknesses. Finding those weaknesses leads to huge growth in your ability to understand and apply what you know. If you review practice questions like we've talked about, you'll likely improve your understanding of some topics and learn new things about them. However, it's very easy to forget what you've learned if you do not work on committing it to memory. So you want to have a system in place to make sure you revisit those insights and get them memorized. In the previous video about how to go over content, we discussed making scaffolds. This is my preferred method of content review, and if you take that approach, you can just add simple notes to your scaffolds explaining what you've learned. It's easy to put these in the appropriate spots, and if they have to do with multiple topics, you can show this very easily. If you do not use scaffolds, you would still benefit greatly from tracking these things in a spreadsheet or another document. If you do take the scaffold approach to content, then anytime you practice free recall, as discussed in the previous video, make yourself also recall the things you've added to them. If you decide to take a different approach, just make sure you work on getting the information memorized well enough that you're able to recall it when needed. If you want to learn more about making scaffolds to learn your MCAT content, click the link to the first video of this series. The next video in the series will take an in-depth look at how to create a schedule, more on when to do practice questions, and what order to do the topics in.